The morning they lost everything began like any other morning in Blackstone Crossing, with dust. It came off the street in thin, slow curtains, kicked up by the hooves of horses that didn't belong there yet, by wagon wheels that had rolled in overnight carrying men who'd traveled a long way for this particular piece of business. Vivian Hartwell noticed the wagons first, before she heard anything, before she understood what day it truly was. She was standing at the window of the room above her father's dry goods store, pulling her hair back with both hands, watching the street below fill with strangers. Then she heard the shouting downstairs and her stomach dropped the way it only does when something is already too late to stop. She found her father in the store's back room, not behind the counter where he should have been, but backed into the corner beside the broken barrel he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. 2 men stood between him and the door. They were not the kind of men who came to buy flour or nails. "Mr. Hartwell," the taller one said. His name was Prescott. She'd learn it later, learn to hate the sound of it. "You had until the 1st of the month." "I know when I had until," her father said. He was a small man, Edmund Hartwell, smaller than Vivian remembered him being when she was young, as though the years had compressed him gradually. His voice still had some steadiness in it, but it was the steadiness of a man who knows the argument is already over. "I'm asking for 2 more weeks. The shipment isn't coming," the second man said. His name was Aldous Fitch, and he had a face that seemed designed to deliver bad news. "We've already spoken to your supplier in Carson City. There is no shipment." The silence after that was the worst kind. The kind that doesn't mean anyone is thinking, but that everyone already knows what comes next. Vivian stepped fully into the room. "What is this?" Her father looked at her, and in his face was something she'd never seen there before. Not fear exactly, but the thing that comes after fear has been sitting in a man's chest for so long it hollows him out. He looked like an empty version of himself. "Vivian, go back upstairs." "I'm not going back upstairs." Prescott turned to look at her with the particular patience of a man who finds other people's distress mildly tedious. "Miss Hartwell, your father owes a substantial debt. The store, the property, and everything in it has been signed over as collateral. That time has passed. We are here today to settle accounts." "Settle accounts," she repeated. "In full." She looked at her father. "Papa, what does he mean, everything?" Edmund Hartwell closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked at his daughter the way people look at something they've already started grieving. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I kept thinking I'd find a way." That was the morning. By noon, everything was different. Basram. Clara was 17, 4 years younger than Vivian, and she had their mother's eyes, wide-set, gray-green, the kind of eyes that noticed everything and hid nothing. When Vivian found her in their shared room and explained what had happened, Clara didn't cry immediately. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. "Where will we go?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet." "Are we keeping anything?" Vivian looked around the room. The dresses, the small mirror above the washstand, the books on the shelf Clara had carried from their last house when they moved to Blackstone Crossing 3 years ago, wrapped carefully in an old quilt to protect the spines. "I don't know that either." Clara nodded slowly. Then she said, "How much did Papa owe them?" "More than I knew about." "More than he knew about?" Vivian thought about that. "I think he knew. I think he just couldn't figure out how to say it." Clara was quiet again, then more quietly. "Is he going to be all right?" It was the question Vivian didn't have an answer to, and the fact that she didn't have one scared her more than anything else that morning. More than the men downstairs, more than the word collateral, more than the sick feeling in her chest when she'd understood what all of it meant. Edmund Hartwell had made bad choices and borrowed against things he shouldn't have, and believed in a shipment that was never coming. And somewhere in the middle of all that, he'd forgotten to tell his daughters that their lives were built on a foundation that was cracking. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't even a weak one exactly. He was a man who had found it easier to hope than to plan, and that distinction, Vivian was learning, could cost everything. "He'll be all right," she said, because Clara needed to hear it. She wasn't sure she believed it. What happened next was humiliating in the specific way that public spectacle is humiliating. Not just painful, but witnessed. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Prescott and Fitch had moved through the store like men taking inventory of a warehouse, which was, Vivian supposed, exactly what they were doing. They wrote numbers in a ledger and spoke to each other in low voices and paid no more attention to the Hartwells than they would have to furniture. Edmund sat in the chair behind the counter where he'd always sat to do the day's accounts, and he watched them with his hands folded in his lap. He looked diminished in a way that Vivian had no vocabulary for. The problem, the part that would come later, the part that would play out in front of the whole town of Blackstone Crossing, was the debt still outstanding after the store and its contents were tallied. Fitch explained it to her in the afternoon while Prescott went through the ledgers. He explained it without particular cruelty, which somehow made it worse. The store and all its inventory, the building itself, the 2 horses in the back paddock, and the wagon and the remaining stock from the supply room, all of it together didn't fully cover what Edmund Hartwell owed. There was a remaining balance, and Fitch and Prescott, as representatives of a creditor whose name Vivian had never heard before that morning, had specific legal authority to collect on that balance. "I don't understand," Vivian said. If there's nothing left, then there's nothing left." "There are labor contracts," Fitch said. He said it the way you say something you know is going to land badly, slightly faster than normal, to get past it quicker. "Your father has agreed to settle the remaining balance through a period of contracted service, for himself and—" He paused, and that pause was its own cruelty. "For his daughters." She heard the words. She understood each one individually. For a moment she couldn't make them connect. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Indenture contracts. 3 of them. Your father signed them this morning." Vivian turned and looked at her father. He was still in the chair. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the window, at the dust in the street outside, at anything that wasn't his daughter's face. "Papa," she said. He said nothing. "Papa, look at me." He looked at her, and she saw it then. Not guilt exactly, but something worse than guilt. The look of a man who had made a choice he couldn't take back and had decided that the only thing left to do was carry it. "I didn't see another way," he said. "There was another way, any other way. The debt had to be, not like this." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it for cracking, hated that her voice would choose this moment to betray her. "Not us. You didn't have the right to sign for us. I'm your father. That's not the same thing as owning us." The room was quiet. Fitch had made himself very still in the corner, the way people do when they are pretending not to hear a conversation they are absolutely hearing. Edmund Hartwell looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked away again. "There wasn't another way," he said, very quietly, and that was all. Time. The auction took place the following morning in the open ground beside Hennessy's feed store, which occupied the widest lot on Blackstone Crossing's main street and had, over the years, hosted a number of public proceedings that the town would have preferred not to remember. It was the kind of thing that Vivian had known existed, had known the way you know about things that happen elsewhere, to other people, and had never once imagined might involve her. The crowd was larger than she expected. That surprised her, and then, immediately afterward, it didn't. Blackstone Crossing was not a large town, but it was a town with not much to break up the weeks, and a public auction, this particular kind of public auction, drew people out of simple human appetite for spectacle. She recognized faces: the woman who sold eggs at the market on Thursdays, the blacksmith's apprentice. 3 men she'd seen in the store more times than she could count. They stood in the morning light with their arms crossed, or their hands in their pockets, and they looked at the platform where Vivian and Clara and their father were standing, and most of them had the decency to look uncomfortable, but none of them had the decency to leave. Clara stood very close to Vivian, close enough that their arms pressed together. She hadn't said much since the night before. She'd moved through the morning with a particular quietness that was different from her usual quietness, something inside it that felt breakable. Vivian kept her arm against Clara's and didn't look at the crowd. Edmund stood a little apart from them. He had aged in the last 2 days in a way that wasn't entirely physical. He simply looked less present than he had before, as though the version of himself that had believed things would work out had quietly stepped back. Prescott stood at the front of the platform with the ledger and announced the terms. Vivian listened and heard the words and cataloged them in the part of her mind that was still functioning practically, because she didn't have the luxury of not understanding what was happening to her. A period of contracted service. Duration negotiable based on bid. Legal obligation of the contracted parties to serve the holder in whatever domestic or labor capacity. She stopped listening at capacity and looked at the street beyond the crowd, at the dust and the buildings and the flat blue sky above Blackstone Crossing, and thought that whatever happened next, she would survive it. She didn't know much in that moment, but she knew that. The bidding started with her father. He went quickly. A rancher from the south part of the county took the contract for a modest sum, apparently with the intention of using Edmund for stable work. The rancher looked like he'd done this kind of thing before and had no particular feelings about it one way or another. Then Prescott called Clara's name. Vivian heard her sister's sharp intake of breath, felt it through the arm pressed against hers. "It's all right," Vivian said very quietly. It was not all right, but she said it anyway. The bidding on Clara moved faster than it should have, which told Vivian things she didn't want to know. There were 3 men in the crowd who wanted her sister's contract, and their reasons were not hidden in their faces. One of them, a stout man in a merchant's coat, raised the bid with a smile that made Vivian feel sick in a physical way, like the ground had shifted underfoot. She was watching the merchant when a new voice came from the back of the crowd. $20 above. The crowd shifted. Several people turned. Vivian couldn't see who'd spoken from where she was standing. There were too many bodies between her and the back of the gathering. But the voice was calm and carried easily over the noise, the kind of voice that doesn't need to raise itself to be heard. The merchant looked irritated. He raised again. 50 above that, the same voice said. The merchant's smile was gone now. He made one more bid, the number higher than Vivian had thought anyone would spend on a labor contract, and there was a brief pause from the back of the crowd. Double it, the voice said. That ended the bidding on Clara. Then Prescott called Vivian's name, and she stepped forward and looked at the crowd and kept her face as still as she could make it, because she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She was 21 years old, and she had done nothing to deserve any of this, and she knew it, and that knowledge was the only solid thing she had to hold on to. The bidding on her started low and climbed. The merchant in the coat was gone. Apparently his funds had limits, but there were others. She stood and looked at the sky and listened to the numbers and concentrated on breathing. And then the voice from the back of the crowd said, at a number that silenced everyone, "That covers them both." She saw him clearly for the first time when the crowd parted. He was tall, and he moved through the space the crowd made for him without apparent self-consciousness. Not the swagger of a man performing confidence, just someone who walked at his own pace and didn't seem concerned about who was watching. He was wearing trail clothes, not dressed for anything, which meant he'd come as he was, without preparation. His face was angular, weathered in the way that faces get when they've spent significant time in wind and sun, not unpleasant, but marked. He was probably in his early 30s. His hat was dark brown and pushed back slightly, and there was nothing about him that announced itself. He handed Prescott a bank draft without looking at the man and said, "I'll need both contracts." Prescott looked at the draft, looked up. "This is for—" "I know what it's for." The merchant in the coat said something sharp from the crowd. Vivian didn't catch the exact words but heard the tone, accusatory, suggesting something about the nature of a man who would spend that sum on 2 women's contracts. Several other voices joined, most of them male, most of them making the same implication in various ways. The man with the dark brown hat didn't respond to any of them. He took the contracts from Prescott, looked them over briefly, and turned to the platform. He looked at Vivian first, then at Clara, and his expression was entirely ordinary. Not the look of a man who'd just purchased something, not triumphant or acquisitive or any of the things she'd been bracing for. He looked like someone who'd done something practical and was already thinking about what came next. "My name is Colton Mercer," he said, just loudly enough for them to hear. "I have a ranch about 15 miles out, northeast of town. I run cattle, have some horses, about 400 acres under decent management." A pause. "You'll both have a home with me. That's all I'm promising you." Vivian looked at him. She studied his face with the specific attention of someone who needs to know if they're about to be lied to. She was very good at it, she thought. She'd been paying attention her whole life. She didn't find what she was looking for. She didn't find the hidden current of self-interest, the small tell, the thing that always showed itself eventually if you knew how to look. She didn't find it, which didn't mean it wasn't there. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider the question seriously, which was not what she expected. Most men would have deflected it, made a joke, said something dismissive. He took a moment and then said, "Because nobody stepped in, and somebody should have." It was a peculiar answer. She'd think about it later, turn it over, try to locate the angle in it. In that moment, standing on the platform in front of the town that had just watched her be sold, she looked at Colton Mercer and made the only calculation available to her. He was not the worst option. He might be dangerous in ways she couldn't see yet. He might prove to be exactly what everyone in that crowd was implying with their voices and their eyes. But he was the option she had. "We'll need our things," she said. "Take whatever you need." The ride out of Blackstone Crossing was quiet in the way that things are quiet after something loud. The silence with weight to it, with the shape of everything that had just happened still pressing in. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, her bundle of belongings beside her, looking at the town receding behind them. Vivian sat up front beside Colton Mercer, which felt strange and also like the only place she should be, close enough to watch him. He didn't try to make conversation, which she noted. He drove the wagon with the ease of someone who'd done it many times, hands loose on the reins, letting the horses find their pace on the road east. The land opened up around them as the town fell away, grass and sage, and the occasional rocky outcropping, the sky enormous above it. After about 20 minutes, Clara said from the back very quietly, "Thank you." Colton Mercer glanced back briefly. "You're welcome." Silence again. Vivian watched the road ahead and thought about her father being driven south by the rancher who'd bought his contract and didn't let herself think too long about it. She thought about the merchant in the coat and was grateful for the distance between herself and him in a way that felt like swallowing something bitter. She thought about the contracts in Colton Mercer's pocket and what they legally entitled him to and whether she was being naive and not fighting harder. And sitting here beside the stranger on a wagon bench, riding toward a ranch she'd never seen. She was not naive, she decided. She was strategic. There was a difference. She was choosing the best of the available options. And she was keeping her eyes open, and she would continue keeping them open every single day until she understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. He didn't seem surprised by the question. 7 years. "You run it alone?" "I have 2 hired men, brothers. They've been with me 5 years. "And before the ranch?" A short pause. "Cattle drives. Before that, whatever work I could find." She waited to see if he'd offer more. He didn't. She tried a different angle. "Nobody thinks to ask why a man buys 2 labor contracts at that price?" "I imagine plenty of people will have opinions about it." "That doesn't concern you?" He glanced at her sideways. "I found that people who worry a great deal about what other people think tend to make bad decisions." He looked back at the road. "I did what I thought was right. Other people can think whatever they like." It was a simple thing to say, and he said it simply, without drama. Vivian filed it away. "What do you expect from us?" she asked directly, because she was tired of circling it. Specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone formulating a lie, but of someone choosing words with care. "The ranch needs managing, cooking, keeping the house, helping with lighter stock work if you're willing. I won't ask more than that." Another pause. "I won't ask anything that's not in those contracts. And if you read the contracts, you'll find I wrote them before Prescott ever showed them to your father." She turned to look at him. "You wrote them. I heard what was happening 2 days ago. I had time to prepare." He said it without apology, but also without self-congratulation, just as a fact. The contracts specify domestic work only, reasonable hours, your own rooms, and a period of 18 months after which they can be dissolved at your request. She continued to look at his profile. "You anticipated all of that." "I tried to." "Why?" He was quiet again, and this time the silence went on long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I told you. Nobody stepped in. Somebody should have." "That's not an explanation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The ranch appeared at the crest of a low ridge, and it was not what Vivian expected, though she'd been careful not to expect anything specific. It was not grand. It was not particularly orderly. It had the look of a place that worked hard and wasn't always winning. The main house solid and well built, but needing paint on the north side, the barn large and functional, the fence lines maintained with obvious care, The yard between the structures packed dirt with a few determined weeds pushing up at the edges. It had, she noticed, a garden plot on the east side of the house that someone had started and then abandoned. The ground turned over, but nothing planted. The raised beds sitting empty. 2 men came out of the barn when the wagon came through the gate. Brothers, obviously. Same height, same broad build, same square face with different expressions on it. The older one looked curious and somewhat cautious. The younger one looked openly at Vivian and Clara with an expression that was simply honest surprise. "Mr. Mercer," the older one said. "Holt, this is Vivian Hartwell and her sister Clara. They'll be staying on." He said it without preamble, as a statement of fact. Vivian, Clara, Holt, and his brother Ned. They run everything that gets run around here. Holt nodded once. "Miss Hartwell, Miss Clara," Ned said, "welcome," and seemed to mean it plainly. Clara, who had said almost nothing for the better part of 2 hours, looked at the ranch, looked at the house, looked at the empty garden beds. "Is that a kitchen garden?" she asked. Ned looked where she was looking. "Was going to be. We ran out of time in the spring." "What did you plan to plant?" Ned blinked, apparently not expecting the question. "Tomatoes, some squash, maybe beans if we got around to it." Clara looked at Vivian. Something in her face had shifted. Not happiness exactly, not even close, but something that was at least adjacent to interest. "I know how to grow tomatoes," she said. Colton Mercer came around the wagon and unlatched the back. "Then they'll get grown," he said. The room they gave Vivian was small and smelled of cedar and had a window that looked east, which meant she'd have light in the mornings. There was a bed, a chair, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a pitcher and basin. It was clean. It had the plainness of a room that had been emptied recently and quickly. The walls bare, the surfaces clear, but it was clean, and it was hers. She stood in it alone, after the brief tour of the house that Colton had given them, and felt the weight of the last 2 days settle over her fully for the first time since it had all started. In the chaos of the morning, the auction, the wagon, the introduction to the ranch and its hands, she'd been moving, which meant she hadn't had to feel it yet. Now she was still, and it hit her all at once, the way things do when you finally give them room. The store was gone. The life she'd known in Blackstone Crossing, such as it had been, was gone. Her father was somewhere south of here, sleeping in a stranger's barn probably, and she didn't know when she'd see him again. She was in a room in a ranch owned by a man she'd known for 5 hours, bound to him by a legal contract she hadn't signed herself. And she had no clear idea what her life was going to look like in a week, in a month, in a year. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and breathed. Then she got up, went to the window, and looked at the land. It was late afternoon and the light was going golden and the grass beyond the fence line moved in a light wind, and somewhere a hawk was making a long, lazy circle above the ridge. It was not a kind landscape exactly. It was too spare for that, too ungiving, but it was real, and she was in it, and she was still standing. She heard footsteps in the hallway, then a knock on the open doorframe. She turned. It was Colton Mercer. "Supper's in an hour," he said. "You don't have to help tonight. Holt can manage it." "I'm not helpless," she said, more sharply than she intended. He looked at her, and his expression didn't change in any particular way. Not taken aback, not amused, just attentive. "I know that," he said. "I wasn't suggesting you were. I was suggesting that you've had a hard 2 days and supper can wait one night." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and he looked, ordinary was still the word for it, not threatening, not particularly comforting either, just present. "I'll help with supper," she said. He nodded once. "All right." He turned to go, then stopped. "There's a spare set of keys on the hook in the kitchen, the front door, the root cellar, the storage barn. I'll get you a copy made when I'm in town next." She frowned. "Why?" He looked at her. "Because it's your home," he said, as though that were explanation enough, and walked away down the hall. Vivian stood in the cedar-smelling room and listened to his footsteps recede and thought about the 2 days that had just happened, and thought about the contracts in his pocket, and thought about the garden bed sitting empty in the east yard. She thought about the key on the kitchen hook that he'd offered before she'd asked. She didn't trust him. She wasn't going to trust him. She had no business trusting anyone right now, and she knew it. But she thought, a man who gives you a key is not the same as a man who locks you in. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the hawk completed its circle, and the light kept going gold as the afternoon turned toward evening in the flat, wide country that was, for now, her only option and her only future, and which she was determined to make something of, whatever it turned out to be. The first week at the Mercer Ranch was a lesson in small wars, not with Colton. He kept his distance in a way that was either respectful or calculating, and she hadn't decided which yet. The small wars were with the work itself, with the house that had its own logic she hadn't learned yet, with the kitchen that was functional but disorganized in the way that kitchens become when men have been running them by necessity rather than intention. Vivian found the spice cabinet arranged in no discernible order, the root cellar sorted by size rather than type, 3 different systems for tracking the larder stock, none of them complete. She reorganized it, starting with the root cellar on the second morning, because she needed something she could control. Clara helped, and between them they imposed a logic on the shelves that made sense. And when Holt came to get the preserves for supper and found them moved, he stood in the doorway with a somewhat stunned expression and then said slowly, "That is going to take some getting used to." "You'll manage," Vivian said, not unkindly. Holt looked at the shelves again. Then he said, "Makes sense, actually." And that was that. Ned turned out to be talkative in a way that was useful. He would explain how things worked on the ranch without being asked, not because he was showing off, but because he seemed to assume everyone shared his interest in the details of how cattle were moved and wells were maintained and fencing decisions were made. Clara listened to him with what appeared to be genuine attention, which pleased him, which made him talk more. Vivian let it happen. Clara needed something to be interested in, and the ranch was, she admitted, interesting. The land itself was harder than anything in Blackstone Crossing. The work was harder. The mornings started earlier, the evenings ended later, and there was always something that needed doing that hadn't been on the list when the day started. By the end of the 3rd day, Vivian's hands were rough in places they hadn't been before, and she had discovered muscles in her back she hadn't known existed. She didn't complain. She'd decided early that complaining was not available to her. On the 4th day, she found Colton at the fence line on the eastern edge of the property, replacing a section that had come down in the wind. He was working methodically, pulling the old post, setting the new one, tamping the earth around it, and when he saw her coming, he stopped and waited. "The ledger in the kitchen," she said. "The household accounts, they're a mess." "I know. Do you want me to fix them?" He looked at her for a moment. "Do you know how? I kept the accounts at my father's store for 3 years." He considered this. Then he said simply, "Yes, fix them." It was not a grand moment. It was a practical exchange between 2 people trying to manage a working ranch. But walking back toward the house with the quiet permission to do something useful, something that used her actual mind rather than just her hands, Vivian felt the first small thing that might eventually become all right. She was not happy. She was nowhere near happy. She was angry, still, about the auction and the contracts, and her father's choices, and the look on the merchant's face, and a dozen other things she hadn't sorted through yet. She was not going to pretend otherwise, but she was useful, and in the specific circumstances she was in, useful was a place to start. The rumors reached the ranch on the 9th day, carried by Ned, who'd been into Blackstone Crossing for supplies, and returned with a look on his face that told Vivian he was deciding how much to say. She asked him directly over the dinner preparations before Colton was back from the north pasture. "What are they saying?" Ned set the flour sack down on the table and looked at her. He was not a man who dissembled well. "Nothing worth repeating. Say it anyway." He looked at Clara, who was at the other end of the table chopping vegetables and very deliberately not looking up. Then he looked back at Vivian. "They're saying Mr. Mercer didn't buy labor contracts," he said. "They're saying he bought, well, they're saying it's not a household arrangement." Vivian took that in, set it down in the part of her that dealt with facts. "What else?" "That your father should have kept better track of his business before it came to this. That it's—" He stopped. "That it's our fault," she said. Ned's jaw tightened. "People are stupid," he said, with the flat conviction of a man who has confirmed this theory many times. "People are people," Vivian said. "What else?" "Some of the women in town are saying they won't buy from the store anymore if Prescott and Fitch sell it to the Danner family, because of how the whole thing was handled." He seemed mildly surprised by this information. Apparently Mrs. Hennessy has been fairly loud about it. Mrs. Hennessy was at the auction, Vivian said. She watched the whole thing. Apparently she wasn't pleased with herself for that, Ned said, or so I was told. Clara, who had continued chopping through all of this, said quietly, without looking up, "What does it matter what they think? We're not there anymore." It was the practical thing to say, and Vivian knew it. But she thought about Blackstone Crossing and the crowd and the platform and the way certain faces had looked, and she thought, it matters. Not because she needed them to approve of her, but because approval and disapproval in a frontier community had practical consequences. It affected whether you could do business, whether you could move freely, whether you were safe. She was 15 miles from Blackstone Crossing. She was not safe yet from what they said about her there. When Colton came in at dusk, she told him what Ned had said. He listened, sitting at the kitchen table with his coat still on, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that was too hot to drink. His face was unreadable in the way it often was. Not deliberately closed off, just unhurried. He thought about it before he spoke. "You knew they'd say things," he said. "I knew. I just wanted you to know I know." He looked at her. "It doesn't change anything on my end. It might change things for you, practically. If people in town decide let them decide whatever they want." He said it without heat. "I've done business with this county for 7 years. My reputation is what it is. What people say about what happened at Prescott's auction doesn't change the work I do or the contracts I keep." She looked at him. "You're not worried about it at all." "I didn't say that." He turned the cup slightly in his hands. "I said it doesn't change anything." There was a distinction there, she thought. A man who said he wasn't worried would be lying or oblivious, and he was neither. A man who said it changed nothing was telling you something about how he'd decided to operate. She didn't say anything else. She went back to the supper preparations, and he sat at the table with his cooling coffee. And outside, the wind came across the ridge in the way it did every evening, steady and indifferent. Clara was right that it didn't matter, in one sense. They were here, not there. The work was here. The days were here. But Vivian, chopping the last of the vegetables by the window, thought, "I'm going to make something of this place that nobody can argue with. Whatever anyone says about how I got here, I am going to be something here that stands on its own." She wasn't sure yet what that meant, but she held on to it. On the 11th day, a letter came from her father. Holt brought it in with the supply run, set it on the kitchen table without comment. It was a single page, folded twice, in Edmund Hartwell's cramped handwriting that she'd known her whole life. She read it at the table, alone, Clara out in the garden with Ned, Colton somewhere out on the property. Her father wrote that he was settled in at the Dunmore Ranch to the south, that the work was hard but manageable, that his health was acceptable, that he was sorry. The word sorry appeared 3 times in 3 different places, and each time it landed differently. The first time like a fact, the second time like a plea, the third time like he wasn't sure what else to say. He asked how Clara was. He asked, more cautiously, how Vivian was. He did not ask about Colton Mercer directly, but he mentioned hearing the name, hearing something about what had happened at the auction, in a way that made clear he'd been told and was absorbing it. He wrote, "I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if I deserve it. I kept thinking there was going to be a way through it that didn't come to what it came to, and I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry." Vivian sat with the letter for a long time. She was still angry. She was going to be angry for a while. She knew herself well enough to know that. But the anger was not the only thing. Underneath it was something older and more complicated. The feeling of a person who loves someone and has also been let down by them, and knows that both things are true and neither one cancels the other out. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went back to work. That evening, when Clara asked what the letter said, Vivian said, "He's all right. He's working. He says hello." Clara nodded. They were quiet for a while, working side by side at the kitchen table, sorting the bean seeds Clara had gotten from somewhere. From Ned, probably, who seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of things. "Are you going to write back?" Clara asked. "Eventually," Vivian said. "I'll write him too," Clara said. "All right." The lamp burned low between them, and the wind moved across the ridge, and outside in the darkness the ranch sat on its 400 acres and held them. Imperfect, uncertain, real. The bean seeds Clara had been sorting that night turned out to be a mix. Some pole beans, some bush, a handful of something Ned couldn't quite identify that he said had come from a trader passing through the county 2 seasons back. Clara planted all of it in the East Garden beds on a Thursday morning, working methodically in the way she did most things, pressing each seed into the turned earth with her thumb, spacing them with a concentration that looked almost like prayer, but wasn't. Vivian watched her from the kitchen window and thought that Clara was going to be all right. She wasn't sure about herself yet, but Clara was going to be all right. The second week settled into something that resembled routine, which was its own strange comfort. Vivian had the household accounts sorted by the end of the 10th day. 3 years of loose entries consolidated into a single ledger with running totals and a margin column for notes, organized by month going back as far as she could reconstruct from the receipts she found in a coffee tin on the shelf above the stove. When she showed Colton, he sat with it for a long time, going through it page by page, not speaking. She stood at the other side of the table and waited. "There's a significant amount here I didn't know I was losing," he said finally. "On the feed costs, yes. You've been paying Alderman's rate without negotiating it down. If you bought in larger quantity at the start of each season, the per-unit cost drops considerably." He looked up. "How do you know Alderman's pricing structure?" "I asked Ned what suppliers you use. Then I asked Ned what the going rates were. Then I did the arithmetic." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite surprise but was related to it. The look of a man recalibrating something. "All right," he said. "What else?" "The water rights on the north boundary. You've been paying a maintenance fee to someone named Greer quarterly. There's no corresponding agreement in any of the paperwork I can find. Either there's a document somewhere I haven't seen, or someone's been collecting money without a legal basis for it." His expression shifted. "Greer. You know him." "I know of him. He runs a land office in Millhaven, about 12 miles east." He was quiet for a moment, tapping one finger on the ledger. "My previous arrangement was verbal. It's possible he's been collecting on it without updating the terms." "Without your knowledge?" "Without my attention," he said, which was a different thing, and he said it with a flatness that suggested he was annoyed at himself. "I need to go to Millhaven. You should take the last 2 years of payment records with you when you do." He looked at her again. "You'd have those organized." "I organized them yesterday." Something crossed his face. She thought it might have been the beginning of a smile, but it didn't quite get there. He closed the ledger and pushed it back toward her. "Keep going," he said. "Whatever you find." She took the ledger. "I intend to." It was not warmth, what was developing between them in those early weeks. It was something more like the working respect of two people who have to share a problem and have discovered, to mild mutual surprise, that they are both competent. Vivian had gone in expecting hidden motives and found, instead, a man who was genuinely disorganized in his record-keeping and genuinely capable in everything else. He knew his land with the specificity of someone who'd walked every acre of it in bad weather. He knew his cattle by their markings and their behavioral patterns, could tell you which ones were prone to fence breaking and which ones would follow a lead animal without argument. He was not sentimental about any of it. It was a working operation and he ran it like one. But he was not careless either. Holt told her one afternoon when they were both working in the storage barn and conversation had become easy in the way it does with people who are comfortable around each other, that Colton had taken on the ranch 7 years ago when it was barely functional. The previous owner, an older man named Dawes, had let it run down badly in the last years before his death. Colton had bought it at a low price that reflected the condition it was in, which was the only way he could afford it, and had spent the first 2 years doing almost nothing but repair work. The house, the barn, the fencing, the wells. He did most of it himself, Holt said, stacking a crate with the economical movements of someone accustomed to confined spaces. Ned and I came on in the 3rd year. Before that, it was just him. "For 2 years, Vivian said. "For 2 years. She thought about that. A man alone on a failing ranch for 2 years, repairing things. It explained some things about him, she thought. The self-sufficiency. The quiet. The specific patience he had for problems that had no fast solution. Why did he do it, she asked. Buy a rundown property and spend 2 years fixing it alone? Holt considered this. He was not given to quick answers, which was something she liked about him. He needed somewhere that was his, he said finally. I think that's the short version of it. She didn't push for the long version. She had the feeling she'd get it eventually from some direction she wasn't expecting, and that pushing would only close it off. The drought came in the third week. It hadn't rained in Blackstone County for 6 weeks before Vivian and Clara arrived at the ranch, she learned. That was the context she'd been missing for the particular tightness she'd noticed in the way Colton looked at the sky each morning. The grass on the south pasture was already going brown at the edges. The creek that ran along the north fence line had dropped significantly from its usual level. Holt and Ned had been rationing the water in the stock tanks, moving the cattle to rotate them off exhausted ground, doing the careful arithmetic of how long the existing resources could hold against the heat. She heard Colton and Holt going over it one evening on the porch, voices low, and she stood just inside the screen door and listened without apology because it was information she needed. "If it doesn't break by the end of the month," Holt said, "we're going to have to sell off some of the herd, the young stock first." "I know. The price won't be good right now. Everyone in the county's in the same position." "I know that too." A pause. "There's Greer." Colton's voice went quieter, which on him meant something. "What about Greer?" "He's been making offers on the North Quarter. His man came to Alderman's while I was there for the feed run. Said Greer's looking to expand his operation, looking at a few properties in this end of the county." "Greer doesn't run cattle." "No," Holt said. "He doesn't." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll go to Millhaven next week," Colton said. "Get those water rights sorted on paper before any of this gets further along." "You want me to come?" "No, stay with the herd." The screen door creaked slightly when Vivian shifted her weight, and both men went quiet. She pushed it open and came out onto the porch. Neither of them pretended they hadn't known she was there, which she appreciated. "Greer," she said, "the one who's been collecting the water fees." "The same," Colton said. "And now he's making offers on land." "On other people's land in a drought year," Holt said, with a flatness that communicated his opinion of it clearly. Vivian looked out at the dark yard, the barn shapes against the darker sky. "That's a particular kind of man," she said. "Yes," Colton agreed. "What happens to the water rights if he buys property adjacent to yours?" Colton looked at her. "Complicated," he said. "That's not an answer. It's an honest one. Water law in this territory is not straightforward. It depends on what the original grant language says, and I haven't had a lawyer look at it in 3 years." "Then get a lawyer to look at it before you go to Millhaven," she said. "Don't go in without knowing exactly what you own." He looked at her for a moment, and she couldn't tell if he was annoyed or considering it. Then he said, "There's a lawyer in Duran's Creek, 15 miles west. That's less far than being wrong about your own property line." Holt made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Colton said nothing, but the following morning he rode west toward Duran's Creek before breakfast, and didn't come back until late afternoon with a folder of papers under his arm and a look on his face that suggested the lawyer had confirmed at least some of what Vivian suspected. He told her at the kitchen table while the supper was going. "The original grant language is specific. The water rights on the north boundary are tied to the property deed, not to any maintenance arrangement. Greer had no legal basis to charge the quarterly fee." "How much does he owe you?" Colton's jaw tightened slightly. 18 months of payments." "You're going to collect it." "I'm going to try." "You're going to collect it," she said again, not as a question. "And you're going to have that confirmed in writing before you leave Millhaven." He looked at her steadily. "You're very certain about things." "I'm certain about what's right," she said. "Whether it happens is a different question." He considered that. "Fair enough," he said, and went to wash up for supper. Clara came in from the garden with dirt on her knees and her hair coming undone from its pins, carrying 3 tomatoes that had come in early, small and still slightly green, but actual tomatoes, real ones, the first thing grown in that garden in at least 2 seasons. She set them on the table with a casualness that didn't quite conceal how pleased she was about them. "Where did those come from?" Ned said from the doorway. "The garden," Clara said. "Where do tomatoes usually come from?" Ned looked at the tomatoes. Then he looked at Clara. "It's been 6 years since this ranch had a working kitchen garden," he said. "Well," Clara said, going to the washstand, "now it has one." It was a small thing. It was the smallest kind of thing. But Vivian, setting plates on the table, felt something in her chest go slightly less rigid at the sight of the 3 tomatoes sitting in a row on the kitchen table, real and imperfect and green at the edges. The town's opinions arrived at the ranch in various forms over the following weeks, through Ned's supply runs, through the occasional traveler who stopped for water, through a letter from Mrs. Hennessy that was addressed to Vivian directly and arrived with slightly apologetic energy, as though the woman wasn't entirely sure she had the right to write. The letter was polite and somewhat stilted. Mrs. Hennessy wrote that she wanted Vivian to know that not everyone in Blackstone Crossing felt the same way about the situation, that she personally found the whole business of the auction distasteful, and that she hoped Miss Hartwell was finding the arrangement tolerable. She did not go so far as to say anything directly critical of Prescott or Fitch or the creditor whose name nobody seemed to want to say plainly. But she signed it warmly, and enclosed a small paper of dried herbs that she wrote were good for headaches. And something about the enclosure made Vivian think of her differently than she had on the platform. She wrote back. Briefly, practically. She was fine. Clara was fine. The ranch was a great deal of work, and the drought was a concern, but manageable. She thanked Mrs. Hennessy for writing. She did not say anything about Colton Mercer, because she didn't know what she would say. What she knew about him, by the end of the first month, was this. He didn't lie when he could tell the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. He worked as hard as his hired men and didn't make a performance of it. He had a temper that she'd seen evidence of twice, once when a section of fence on the south quarter came down and scattered a portion of the herd, once when Ned came back from a supply run with the wrong specification of lumber and the repair work had to stop while the right material was sourced, but in both instances he'd stated his frustration directly and then returned to solving the problem, without directing it at anyone who hadn't caused it. He kept his word. That last thing she was accumulating evidence for steadily, because it was the thing that mattered most and also the thing most easily faked. He'd said she'd have her own room. She had it. He'd said the contract specified domestic work only, reasonable hours. That was what was asked of her. He'd said she could have keys. The keys were on the hook in the kitchen, hers whenever she wanted them. None of this meant she trusted him. Trust was a structure you built slowly out of consistent materials over time, and she'd known him for 4 weeks. But she was keeping records in her own way, the same way she kept the household ledger. Entries noted, running total maintained, nothing written off before the evidence warranted it. The drought broke, partially, on a Thursday night at the end of the month. Not the kind of rain that fixes a drought, but the kind that interrupts it. Steady for 6 hours, soaking into the ground, dropping the temperature by 15 degrees. Vivian woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of it on the roof and lay in the dark listening to it, and felt something in her unknot slowly. In the morning, the creek on the north boundary was running higher. The grass on the south pasture still looked worn but less desperate. Clara went out to the garden in her boots and stood in the wet soil and assessed the tomatoes, which had gone greener overnight somehow, as though the rain had argued with them. Colton was on the porch when Vivian came out with the first coffee of the morning, watching the sky, which was still overcast in a promising way. "Better?" she asked. "Some," he said. "If we get another one like that before the week's out, it'll help." She handed him one of the cups. He took it without making anything of the gesture, which she appreciated. Any other man might have, and she didn't have patience for it. They stood on the porch and looked at the wet ground and the damp fence lines and the cattle moving slowly on the south pasture, which was its own kind of relief. "I'm going to Millhaven Wednesday," he said. "I know. I'd like to take this payment records with me. They're already in the folder on the desk. I labeled it." He looked at her sidelong. "Of course you did." "Was that a criticism?" "No," he said. "Definitely not." She drank her coffee. He drank his. The morning came in slowly over the ridge, gray and cool and smelling of wet earth, which was the best smell the frontier had to offer after a dry month. Then he said, without preamble, "I had a sister." She looked at him. He was still watching the south pasture, not at her. "She was younger than me by 5 years," he said. "She married a man who seemed all right and turned out not to be. Nobody in our town stepped in. She had 2 small children and no money and nowhere to go, and the people who could have helped her looked the other way because it was uncomfortable, and by the time something finally happened, it was too late to fix." Vivian was quiet. He wasn't looking at her, which was why he could say it, she thought. She's all right now, he said after a moment. She's in Oregon, remarried, doing well. But it took a long time to get to all right, and it didn't have to. That's why, Vivian said. That's why. He said it without asking for anything. No acknowledgement, no absolution, no thank you. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying a while when you finally find a place to set it down briefly, not because you expect anything in return, but because the weight of it needed stating. She looked at the pasture. The cattle moved slowly through the wet grass, unhurried. She's lucky she has you, Vivian said. I didn't do enough at the time. I was too far away, and I told myself there was nothing I could do, and that was cowardice dressed up as practical reasoning. You were different then. I hope so. They stood a while longer. When she went back inside to start breakfast, she thought about what he'd told her and sat with it carefully, the way you sit with information that changes the shape of something. Not the shape of him exactly. She'd suspected there was something like this, some personal history that explained a man who would spend that sum at an auction without hesitation, but the shape of the whole thing. The ledger she kept in her head on him got an entry. He told you the truth about something he didn't have to tell you. She fried the eggs with a little more attention than usual and didn't think too hard about why. Millhaven was 12 miles east on a road that turned to mud after rain, and Colton came back from it on Wednesday evening with a different expression than he'd left with. Not triumphant, but settled. The look of a man who's finished a thing that needed finishing. He dropped the folder on the kitchen table and said, Greer's going to repay every quarter. He'll dispute it, but the documentation's solid. Vivian looked up from the ledger. Did he try to argue it? His clerk tried. His lawyer made a sound argument for 2 minutes, and then stopped making it when I put the original grant language on his desk. Good. Also, Colton said, pulling out a chair, there's something you should know. Greer has been making approaches to 3 properties on the east side of the county. All of them are running into the same drought problems. 2 of them have outstanding debts. Vivian set down the pencil. He's looking to consolidate. Land, water access, and the road through the East Quarter, which connects to the Millhaven Market Road. He sat down. If he gets all 3 properties plus the road access, he controls the primary route to market for everything in this end of the county. Including your cattle. Including everything I move. She thought about it. He doesn't need to threaten anyone directly. He just needs to own the route and set the terms. That's my reading. Who are the other 2 property owners? A widow named Dunmore, a different family from the Dunmore ranch your father is at, different branch. And a man named Taft, who runs a small horse operation. Neither of them has money to fight illegal action. Do they know what Greer's doing? I don't know. Probably not the full picture. Vivian looked at the ledger in front of her, thought about Prescott and Fitch and the auction block and the specific mechanics of how people with money and patience could construct circumstances that looked like bad luck until you saw the whole drawing. This is the same pattern, she said. The auction. The auction was one piece. The water fees were another piece. The property offers during a drought year. She traced the shape of it with her pencil on the edge of the ledger paper, not writing, just following the logic. Someone has been building this for a long time. Years, possibly. Colton was watching her. I had the same thought. Prescott and Fitch. Our employees, he said. The creditor whose name nobody says. That's who I'd want to know about. She looked at him. Your lawyer in Duran's Creek. Can he find that out? He can look. Then have him look. She picked up the pencil. And in the meantime, tell me everything you know about the road through the East Quarter. If that's what this is actually about, that's where the fight is going to happen. Holt appeared in the doorway at that point, took in the papers on the table and both of their expressions and said, Should I be worried? Probably not yet, Colton said. But potentially, Vivian added. Holt looked from one to the other. Right, he said. I'll check the fences. And retreated, which was probably wise. The drought came back the following week. Not as bad as before, but present. The sky turning the particular shade of white that meant no rain coming anytime soon. The creek on the north boundary dropped again. Colton moved half the herd to the west pasture, which had a better water source, and Holt and Ned spent 3 days retrenching the main stock tank to hold more capacity. Vivian organized the root cellar for winter storage even though winter was months away, because organization in advance was the only thing she could control when the weather wouldn't cooperate. Clara's garden was producing in small, determined quantities. The tomatoes came in red eventually, all of them, even the stubborn green ones. There were beans, 2 types, and a quantity of squash that surprised everyone, including Clara. She moved through the garden each morning with a focused practicality, pulling weeds, checking the soil moisture, making small adjustments that nobody asked her to make, but that resulted in the plants doing better than any comparable garden on a dry-year ranch had reason to do. Ned watched her work sometimes, leaning on the fence with a coffee cup, not saying much. He was not a subtle person, Ned, but he had the basic decency to keep his admiration at a level that didn't require acknowledgement, which Vivian thought was more than could be said for many men. Clara was aware of it. She mentioned it once to Vivian with a kind of amused neutrality that suggested she had filed it in a category she wasn't ready to examine yet. "He's very earnest," she said. "He is," Vivian agreed. "I don't know what to do with earnest people." "You don't have to do anything with them. Just let them be earnest." Clara thought about this. That seems overly simple. Most solutions are. It was a conversation about nothing and also about everything, and they left it there. What Vivian didn't tell Clara, because she wasn't sure how to say it, was that she'd started noticing things about Colton Mercer that she hadn't meant to notice. Not large things. Not the kind of thing you could point to and say, "Here, this is significant." Small things. The way he talked to the horses, which was direct and unaffected and lacked the performative quality that men often brought to animals when they wanted to be observed being good with them. The way he'd fixed the latch on the kitchen door that had been sticking since before they arrived, without being asked and without mentioning it, so that one morning Vivian simply found it working correctly. The way he'd looked, the evening she'd told him about the organization of the root cellar for winter, like a man remembering something he'd meant to do and being quietly relieved it was done. She noticed these things and filed them carefully and tried not to place too much weight on them because she knew the difference between a man who was fundamentally decent and a man she was entitled to care about, and she was not at all sure those two things had converged here. She'd known him for 6 weeks. She'd been living in his house, working alongside him, sleeping 30 feet from him in a room with a cedar smell and an east-facing window. The intimacy of proximity was not the same thing as the intimacy of choice. She knew that. She knew it, and she kept the ledger in her head, and she added entries carefully, and she told herself she was being practical. The letter from Edmund Hartwell came at the end of the 6th week, longer this time, more detailed. He was managing at the Dunmore Ranch. Work was hard, but he was managing. His health was holding. He'd heard things, he wrote, about a man named Greer, about property dealings in the east part of the county. He'd heard from another worker at Dunmore's that Greer had been asking questions about the Mercer Ranch specifically, its water rights, its debt load, whether the owner was likely to be in a position to fight a legal challenge. Vivian read this paragraph 3 times. She brought the letter to Colton at the desk after supper, when the house was quiet and Holt and Ned had gone to the bunkhouse and Clara was already in her room. She set it in front of him without explanation and watched him read it. When he finished, he sat back in the chair and said, "Your father has better information than I expected. He works alongside people who talk. So does the man who works alongside him. Greer's asking about our debt load." He said it slowly, like he was tasting each word. "That means he thinks there's something to find. Or he's hoping to create something to find." Colton looked at her. Meaning people with money and patience don't wait for problems. They manufacture them. She'd been thinking about this for 2 days since the conversation about Prescott and Fitch, and the shape of it had clarified in that time. If Greer can find a debt to call in, or create a legal dispute over the water rights that was already partly his doing since he was collecting fees without basis, if he can put you in a position where you need cash quickly, he makes an offer at the right moment. At the only possible moment, he was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the porch boards, the particular sound of the ranch at night that she'd gotten used to without intending to. "I don't have significant debt," he said. "The property is clear. I have a line of credit with the bank in Millhaven that I've never drawn on. He doesn't know that. He will once he looks properly, which means he'll try something else." She folded her hands on the desk. "What does he actually need? Not this ranch specifically, but the thing this ranch provides." "The East Road access," Colton said. "The North Water. If he can't buy it, he'll try to compromise it. The water rights dispute you told him was resolved. Is it resolved on paper?" My lawyer filed the documentation. Does Greer know that? A pause. Probably not yet. Then he's still operating under the assumption that it's a vulnerability. She looked at the letter, at her father's cramped handwriting. We need to make sure anyone who might be talking to Greer knows the water situation is clean, not defensively, just as a matter of public record. You want me to be visible about it. I want the information to be available to whoever's looking. That's different. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she recognized from the first week. The recalibration, the internal adjustment of an assumption. As though he kept expecting her to be something smaller than she was, and kept being surprised when she wasn't. She was getting tired of being surprising. She wanted, at some point, to simply be known, but that was its own separate problem, and she tucked it away. All right, Colton said. I'll talk to the lawyer tomorrow. And the widow Dunmore and the man named Taft. They deserve to know what they're dealing with. I'll write out to both of them this week. Take me with you, she said. He looked at her. Why? She considered how to say it. Because a man writing to warn his neighbors about a land speculator looks like self-interest. A man and a woman writing together looks like community. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's a very particular way of thinking about it. I've had practice. He agreed, and they went to do what needed doing, and the ranch sat on its 400 acres under the dry late summer sky and held them. Two people who were not comfortable, not at ease, not simple with each other, but who were in their separate and careful ways beginning to trust the ground they were standing on. Not each other. Not yet. But the ground. And sometimes that's where it starts. The ride out to the widow Dunmore's property took most of a morning. Colton knew the road, which was less a road than a set of parallel ruts pressed into the earth by years of wagon traffic, the kind of path that required attention but not conversation. Vivian sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the country go by. The dry grass on the flats, the scattered juniper on the higher ground, the occasional hawk riding a thermal above the ridge. She'd been on this bench before, the first time on the ride from Blackstone Crossing, and the difference between then and now was not comfortable to examine directly. Then she'd been calculating survival odds. Now she was calculating something more complicated, which felt like either progress or a different kind of danger. She'd slept poorly the night before, not because of anything she could name exactly, but because the shape of what she and Colton had laid out at the desk, Greer's pattern, the water rights, the East Road, the vulnerable neighbors, had kept reassembling itself in her head at the hours when her mind was supposed to be resting. She'd gotten up at 4 and sat by the east window until the sky started going gray, and she'd thought about her father's letter and about the auction platform and about the particular mechanics of how men like Greer operated. They didn't come at you directly. They arranged the terrain until there was nowhere to go, and then they waited. She'd seen a version of it already with Prescott and Fitch. The patience of it was what bothered her most. The Dunmore widow's property was smaller than the Mercer Ranch, maybe 150 acres, a modest house with a well-maintained yard and a barn that needed roof work on the south side. Her name was Margaret Dunmore, and she met them at the gate with the specific wariness of a woman who'd been dealing with unwanted visitors and had developed instincts accordingly. She was somewhere in her 50s, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had started out pleasant and gotten stronger over the years. She looked at Colton first, then at Vivian, and some of the wariness shifted into something more like curiosity. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "this is unexpected." "Mrs. Dunmore, this is Vivian Hartwell. She's managing my household accounts, and she knows some things you need to hear." Margaret Dunmore looked at Vivian again. "Is that so?" "I believe so," Vivian said. "Do you have a few minutes?" They sat on the porch, the three of them, and Vivian laid out what she knew without embellishment. The water rights pattern, the quarterly fees collected without legal basis, the drought year offers on properties, the East Road access as the likely primary objective. She spoke plainly and watched Margaret Dunmore's face, which went through several expressions in quick succession before settling on something that looked a great deal like controlled fury. "Greer's man came to me 3 weeks ago," Margaret said, when Vivian finished. "He made an offer on the whole property. Said it was a fair price given the conditions." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." She paused. "I was thinking about it. My son wants me to move to Colorado, be nearer to his family. The offer seemed almost reasonable." Does your deed include language about the water source on your eastern boundary? Vivian asked. Margaret frowned. I don't know. I haven't looked at that deed in years. My husband handled those things. Before we leave, I'd like to look at it, if you'll permit me. The older woman looked at her steadily. You know land documents? I know how to read what's in them and what's missing from them. I kept accounts for 3 years in a dry goods business. It's not the same thing, but the principle is similar. What's written and what's implied are two different problems. Margaret Dunmore was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went inside and came back with a battered wooden box that had the quality of something nobody had opened in a long time. The deed was inside, folded multiple times, the paper brittle at the creases. Vivian spread it carefully on the porch railing and read it twice while Colton and Margaret Dunmore talked about the season and the drought and the cattle market, giving her the space to concentrate. The water language was there, buried in the second page in legal terminology that assumed you were looking for it. It was specific, it was tied to the property, and it included, and this was the part that made her go still for a moment, a right of access clause to the road on the eastern boundary that she was nearly certain Margaret Dunmore had never been told about. Mrs. Dunmore, she said. Both of them stopped talking. You have a legal right of access to the east road that runs along your property boundary. It's in the deed. If Greer buys any of the properties on that road, he cannot legally close it to you without a court proceeding, and even then, this language would likely hold. Margaret came to the railing and looked at the document. Where does it say that? Vivian pointed to the paragraph. Margaret read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, the way people read something they're trying to make absolutely certain they're understanding correctly. I never knew that was in there, she said. Most people don't know what's in their deeds, Vivian said. That's partly how arrangements like Greer's work. They depend on people not knowing what they already own. The older woman straightened up and looked at Vivian with an expression that had moved past wariness entirely. Your father is Edmund Hartwell, she said. I heard about the auction. Vivian held the woman's gaze. Yes. You're staying out at the Mercer Ranch. I am. Margaret Dunmore looked at her for another moment, and Vivian waited for the judgment. The version she'd heard implied in various forms since the auction, the thing people communicated with their eyes when they couldn't quite bring themselves to say it plainly. But it didn't come. What came instead was, I'd like a copy of this deed language. If I can get it to a lawyer, I want someone to confirm what you're telling me. That's exactly what you should do, Vivian said. The lawyer in Duran's Creek is competent and not connected to anyone in the East County. I know him, Margaret said. My husband used him once. She folded the deed carefully and put it back in the box. I won't be selling to Greer, she said, as a simple statement of fact, and that was that. The ride to Taft's horse operation took another hour east, and Vivian spent most of it thinking about the deed language and what it meant for the larger picture. If Dunmore's property had that access clause, it was possible that other properties along the East Road had similar language, which meant that Greer's plan, if controlling the road was the actual objective, was more complicated than he might have calculated. Land law in the territory was not uniform. It was a collection of individual grants and historical claims and water agreements, each with its own specific language, and the whole structure of it depended on most landowners not knowing their own documents well enough to use them. She said as much to Colton. You're thinking he might not have read all the deeds either, Colton said. I'm thinking his plan assumed a certain level of ignorance. That's a vulnerability. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. We'd need to look at Taft's deed too. We'd need to look at every deed on that road eventually, but one at a time. The man named Taft turned out to be younger than Vivian expected. Barely 30, lean and sun-darkened, with 2 small children running loose in the yard, and a wife who watched from the doorway with an expression that communicated both exhaustion and alertness in equal measure. He was polite but guarded in the way of someone who'd been burned by strangers before and hadn't entirely recovered from it. He'd already gotten Greer's offer. He was closer to accepting it than Margaret Dunmore had been. The drought had hit his horse operation hard. He had a note at the Millhaven Bank that was coming due in 60 days, and the offer, he said, was enough to cover the note with some left over. He said this with the flat practicality of a man who'd already run the numbers and found only one column that balanced. Before you decide, Vivian said, can I ask you something? He looked at her. Go ahead. What does your deed say about the East Road access? A pause. I don't know. I've never looked at the access language specifically. She looked at Colton. He looked back at her with an expression that was by now familiar. The one where he let her run with something because she was moving faster than he was, and he'd learned not to slow it down. I'd like to look at your deed, she said to Taft. It took him 20 minutes to locate it. It was in a chest in the back room under a pile of harness that needed repair, and Vivian spread it on his kitchen table while his wife brought water and stood behind her husband's shoulder reading along. The access clause was there, different language than Dunmore's, but the same essential right. The water source on the north side of his property was tied to the deed in a way that Greer, if he bought adjacent land, could not legally interfere with without a protracted legal fight, Taft's wife said, before Taft did. That changes things. It might, Vivian said carefully, because she wasn't his lawyer and she knew the difference between reading a document and interpreting it legally. But you should take this to the lawyer in Duran's Creek before you make any decision. This week, if you can. Taft looked at his wife. Something passed between them that Vivian didn't try to read. I can go Thursday, he said. Good. They were back on the road to the Mercer Ranch by early afternoon, the sun working hard at its usual angle and the dust coming up around the horses' feet in small, patient clouds. Vivian was tired in the specific way that comes from 2 hours of careful, high-stakes conversation. Not the tiredness of physical work, but the tiredness of sustained concentration. Colton drove for a while in silence. Then he said, "You're good at that." She looked at him. At what? Talking to people. Getting them to show you things they weren't planning to show anyone. She considered whether this was a compliment or an observation. I just ask direct questions, she said. Most people don't. They circle around, make it conversational. You went straight at it. Circling wastes time. For you, he said. Most people find it less alarming. She thought about that. Margaret Dunmore wasn't alarmed. No. She responded to it the same way you'd expect someone who'd been waiting for straight answers to respond. He was quiet a moment. She looked at you like she recognized you. Vivian said nothing to that. She looked at the road ahead and thought about Margaret Dunmore's face, the wariness going away, what replaced it. I've been thinking, Colton said, about the contracts. She went still. Not in a way that... He stopped, started again, with the care of someone navigating somewhere they don't have a clear map. I've been thinking that the arrangement as it currently stands is not what I want it to be. Meaning I don't want you here because of a document I hold. I've thought that since approximately the 3rd week. She looked at him. He was watching the road, which was either honest or strategic, and she'd learned enough about him by now to think it was probably honest. Why are you telling me this now? Because after today, after watching you at Dunmore's and Taft's, it felt dishonest not to. He paused. I should have said something sooner. I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like something it isn't. What is it then? He thought about that for long enough that she understood he was actually thinking, not stalling. I think you're here because you need to be for now. And I think the arrangement works because we both have something useful to do with the situation. But I want it to be clear that if you wanted to leave, if you or Clara wanted to leave, the contracts would not be the thing that stopped you. She looked at him. The afternoon light was flat and hot and unkind to everything, and he looked the same in it as he always looked, angular, unhurried, difficult to read until you'd been paying attention for long enough. That's a significant thing to say, she said. I know. It changes the legal situation. Not until I say it in front of witnesses, but I'm telling you now so you know where I stand. She turned and looked at the road ahead. The ranch was still a few miles out, the ridge visible on the horizon. I'm not planning to leave, she said. Not for him. She was careful about that, careful to say it as a statement of practical fact rather than anything warmer. We have work to do here. The Greer situation isn't finished. Clara's garden is coming in. I have 2 months of accounts still to reconcile. I know, he said. I wasn't asking you to leave. I was telling you that you could. It was a very particular distinction, and she sat with it the rest of the way home. The week that followed was quieter on the Greer front, but louder in Blackstone Crossing. Ned came back from a supply run with his jaw set in the way that meant he'd heard things he wasn't sure how to repeat, and when Vivian asked him directly, he told her. There was a man in town. She didn't catch the name. It wasn't important. who'd been making conversation at the saloon and at Hennessy's feed store about the arrangement at the Mercer Ranch. Not subtle conversation, the kind that used words like improper and situation and arrangement in a way that made clear the speaker's meaning without requiring him to say it plainly. The kind that invited other people to agree, and some of them did because agreeing was easier than not. The specific form of it, Ned said, with the discomfort of a man who hated having to say this, was that people were questioning whether Vivian and Clara were engaged in domestic labor or something else, and that Colton Mercer's payment at the auction was being characterized as something different from what it was, and that there were people in Blackstone Crossing who had decided on a version of events that required very little contact with the facts. Clara, who had been at the kitchen table when Ned told it, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "People are going to think what they want." "They are," Vivian said. "It's not true." "No." "Does it matter that it's not true?" Vivian looked at her sister. Clara's face was composed. She'd gotten very good at composed since the auction. But there was something underneath it that was tired and young and not entirely deserving of being this tired at 17. "It matters eventually," Vivian said. "Not to the people who want to believe it, but to the ones who don't." Clara nodded slowly. "Mrs. Hennessy." Mrs. Hennessy. Margaret Dunmore now. The Tafts, probably. People who've met us and formed an opinion based on something other than saloon conversation. That's not very many people. It's more than zero. When Colton came in from the North Pasture and heard it from Holt, because Holt had been there too, had heard Ned's account, his expression did something that took Vivian a moment to identify. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something more personal than anger, something that had a specific shape to it. He sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment, and nobody said anything, and then he said, "I need to go into Blackstone Crossing." "To do what?" Vivian asked. "To find the man who's been saying these things and correct his understanding. That will make it worse." "Possibly." "Not possibly. Definitely. A man defending two women's honor in a saloon becomes its own story. It confirms that there's something to defend, which is the same as confirming there's something to explain." He looked at her. "Then what?" She thought about it. "You do nothing about the talk," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "Talk dies when there's nothing to feed it, but the actual situation, the contracts, that's what needs to change." "The contracts. You said on the road, in front of witnesses." She looked at him steadily. "If you tear up the contracts publicly, in town, there's no improper arrangement to imply. Two women living and working on a ranch freely is a different thing than two women bound by legal documents that a man holds." The kitchen was quiet. Holt and Ned were both very carefully attending to things that had nothing to do with the conversation. Colton looked at her. "I told you on the road that you could leave. I know what you told me. This would be more than that. This would be public." "Yes? And then you'd be free to leave, actually free, and you'd stay or go on that basis." "Yes," she said again. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to wonder if she'd misjudged him. She'd built a structure of understanding about him over 2.5 months, entry by entry, and this was the test of whether the structure held. A man who says he'll do the right thing privately is one kind of man. A man who does it publicly, when it costs him something, is another. "When?" he said finally. "Saturday," she said. "Market day in town, when there are people to witness it." He nodded once. "All right." She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady, which she was glad about because she wasn't sure the rest of her was. Saturday came in cold for late summer, one of those mornings that reminded you autumn wasn't as far off as the heat had suggested. The wagon ride to Blackstone Crossing took the better part of 2 hours, and Vivian spent it thinking about the last time she'd made this trip in reverse, in the back of this same wagon, not speaking. The town looked familiar and strange in the way that places do when you've been away long enough to see them differently. The main street dusty and busy with market traffic, people moving between the stalls and the storefronts, horses tied at posts along the street. Colton drove directly to the spot in front of Hennessy's feed store, which was the widest, most public part of the street, where the market traffic was thickest. He set the brake and got down and looked around at the people near enough to observe, and his voice, when he spoke, was the same voice she'd heard at the auction. Not raised, but carrying, the voice of a man who doesn't need to perform volume to command attention. "I'd like people to hear this," he said simply. Heads turned. The particular quality of public attention shifted, the market noise dimming slightly as curiosity redirected itself toward the source. He reached into his coat and produced the 2 contracts. He held them up where people could see them. There was no dramatic gesture in it, no theatrical quality, just a man showing what he had in his hand. Then he said, "These are labor contracts for Vivian and Clara Hartwell, made at the auction 6 weeks ago. I'm voiding them now." He tore the contracts in half, then in half again. Then he put the pieces in his coat pocket because the street wasn't a place to litter. "Miss Hartwell and her sister are free to stay or leave the ranch as they choose. They are not bound to me by any legal document. They are employed in the way any person is employed, freely, with compensation, and with the right to leave when they decide to." He paused and looked at the crowd that had formed. "If anyone has questions about the nature of my household, I'm available to answer them directly." Nobody said anything. Several people who had been among the ones Vivian recognized from the auction were suddenly very interested in the ground in front of them. Mrs. Hennessy was at the front of the small crowd that had gathered. She caught Vivian's eye and gave a short, definitive nod, the kind that means well done. Vivian stood beside the wagon and felt the morning air on her face and looked at the town that had watched her be auctioned and thought about what had just happened. Not with triumph, because triumph would have been cheap, and she was too tired for cheap. She thought about it practically. The contracts were gone. She was standing on a street in Blackstone Crossing as a free woman, which was what she should have been all along. The fact that it had taken this particular path to arrive here was not a thing she was going to make peace with quickly, or easily, or possibly ever. But she was here. She was free. And she was, she discovered, still intending to get back in that wagon and ride to the ranch with Colton Mercer when this was done. She thought about that for a moment, turned it over. Then a man she didn't recognize pushed through the edge of the crowd, heavy-set, well-dressed for a market day, with the look of someone who'd traveled from somewhere else and hadn't quite acclimated to the dust. He had a leather folio under his arm and an expression that managed to be both apologetic and not apologetic at all. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "my name is Aldred Connors. I represent the Greer Land Trust." The crowd, which had been beginning to disperse, didn't disperse. Colton turned to look at the man with the expression he used for problems, not alarmed, but assessing. "Mr. Connors, I have documents here that I believe require your attention." Connors opened the folio. "A legal challenge to the water rights on your north boundary, filed yesterday in the county seat. There's also a dispute against your deed that alleges the original grant to the Dawes estate was not properly transferred to you under territorial law." The silence on the street was the specific kind that happens when a crowd senses that what they came to see isn't over. Vivian looked at the folio in Connor's hand, looked at Colton, looked back at the folio. "May I see those documents?" she said. Connors looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "The documents. May I see them?" He looked uncertain. He'd been prepared for Colton, clearly. Had staged this for Colton, timed it deliberately for the public moment to maximize its damage. He hadn't been prepared for a woman with no legal standing asking to read his folio. Colton said, "Show her." Connors hesitated a moment more, then held out the documents. Vivian took them and read. The crowd waited. She was aware of the attention the way you're aware of weather. Peripheral, constant, not the thing you're focused on. She read the water rights challenge first, then the deed dispute. She read both twice. Then she lowered the papers. The water rights challenge cites a maintenance arrangement as the basis for a competing claim, she said. That arrangement was voided in Millhaven 3 weeks ago with documentation filed. The challenge has no legal basis. Connor's expression shifted. The filing has already been superseded by filed documentation. Your client either knows this or should have known this before you rode to Blackstone Crossing. She looked at the deed dispute. The deed transfer from the Dawes estate to Colton Mercer is documented and recorded. If there's an alleged defect in the territorial transfer, I'd want to know specifically which provision of territorial land law is being cited, because the document I'm looking at does not specify one. It alleges a defect without naming it, which is not how legal challenges work. The crowd was very quiet. Connors said stiffly, "You are not a lawyer, miss." "No," she said. "I'm not. But the lawyer in Duran's Creek is. And my recommendation to Mr. Mercer is that he ride to Duran's Creek this afternoon with both of these documents, which I'd like copies of before you leave, and get a legal opinion before he responds to any of this in writing. She looked at the man steadily. You're welcome to carry that back to Mr. Greer. Connors took the documents back. His face had the specific color of a man who'd come to town to deliver a knockout blow and had found himself explaining his paperwork to a woman who'd read it faster than he wanted. He left without saying much more. The crowd watched him go, and then slowly, in the way of crowds that have seen something satisfying conclude, it began to break up, but not before a number of people looked at Vivian with expressions that had nothing in them of the auction platform, nothing of the whispers, nothing of the version of her that the saloon conversations had been constructing. What they looked at was simply her. And they seemed, for the first time, to be seeing something close to accurate. Colton came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Duran's Creek this afternoon. Yes, she said. You'll come. Obviously. He was quiet. The market noise had started up again around them, the ordinary sounds of a Saturday in a frontier town, commerce and conversation and the smell of horses and dust, and the faint promise of autumn in the air. Vivian, he said. She looked at him. His expression had the quality it sometimes got when he was navigating something without a map. Careful, not quite comfortable, more honest than graceful. Thank you, he said, for today. All of it. She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was not kind, and neither of them looked particularly polished in it, which she found she didn't mind. Don't thank me, she said. Let's go deal with the lawyer. They got back in the wagon, and the town of Blackstone Crossing watched them leave, and it was not the same watching as the first time. Not the watching that follows something shameful, but the watching that follows something that has shifted the understanding of a community slightly. The way a hinge takes a door somewhere new when it finally turns the right direction. Neither of them said anything on the way to Duran's Creek, but somewhere on the dry road between the town and the lawyer's office, Vivian realized that the thing she felt, riding beside Colton Mercer with the torn contract pieces in his coat pocket and Greer's documents in her hand, was not calculation. It was not the careful ledger-keeping she'd been doing since the first day. It was something she hadn't made room for, hadn't intended, and was not entirely sure what to do with. She looked at the road ahead and filed it away in the same careful place she kept everything else, and told herself there would be time to examine it later. There was always more road ahead. That, at least, had not changed. The lawyer in Duran's Creek was a man named Aldrich Bowman, and he had the particular quality of someone who had spent 20 years reading documents that other people hadn't bothered to read and had developed, as a result, a very specific kind of patience. He was thin, gray-haired, with reading glasses that sat low on his nose, and a desk so covered in papers that the desk itself was theoretical. When Vivian and Colton walked in that Saturday afternoon and put Greer's challenge documents in front of him, he read them without speaking for a long time, occasionally going back to a previous page, occasionally making a small sound that communicated nothing definitive. Then he took off his glasses and looked at both of them. The water rights challenge is without merit, he said. I filed the superseding documentation myself 3 weeks ago. Whoever prepared this for Greer either didn't know that or is hoping you don't. He set that document aside. The deed dispute is more interesting. Vivian said, the territorial transfer provision. Bowman looked at her. You read it. On the street in Blackstone Crossing, yes. He considered this for a moment, then looked back at the document. The argument being made is that the original Dawes grant contained a reversionary clause, language that would require the property to revert to the Territorial Land Authority if certain conditions weren't met within the first 10 years of transfer. Greer's position apparently is that those conditions were not met. Colton said, what conditions? That's the question. Bowman put his glasses back on and turned to a bookshelf behind him that contained, Vivian observed, a remarkable number of territorial land records in matching brown folders. He pulled one without hesitation, a man who knew his own system. The Dawes grant is from 1851. The reversionary language, if it exists, would be in the original grant document, not the transfer. He opened the folder, which I happen to have a copy of. The silence while he read was the particular kind that happens in a small office when something significant is being checked. There is a reversionary clause, Bowman said. Colton went very still. It requires that the property be used for active agricultural operation, specifically cattle or crop production, within the first decade of any transfer. He looked up. Mr. Mercer, when did you take ownership? 7 years ago. And you've been running cattle for how long? Since the second year. First year was repair and infrastructure. Do you have records? Cattle sales, herd registers, any documentation of active agricultural use? Colton looked at Vivian. She said, I have 2 years of organized records at the ranch. The years before that are in the coffee tin. Bowman looked between them. The coffee tin. It's how he kept his records when he was running things alone, she said without apology for it. They're receipts, payment records, cattle sale records. They're not organized, but they're there. Bowman took his glasses off again and cleaned them with his shirt, which seemed to be how he thought. If we can demonstrate continuous agricultural use from the second year of ownership, the reversionary clause is moot. Greer's challenge fails. He paused. But we need to move on this before it reaches the county courthouse formally. Once it's on a judge's docket, the timeline becomes theirs, not ours. How long do we have? Colton asked. 2 weeks? Possibly 3. If the clerk in the county seat is as slow as he usually is. Bowman looked at the document again. There's something else. This challenge being filed at all tells me Greer has access to the original Dawes grant language. That document is not public record. It's in the territorial archive in the Capitol. Vivian said, which means he has someone in the territorial archive, or someone who was given access by someone who does. Bowman set the document down carefully. This is not a simple land grab, Mr. Mercer. This has been constructed over time by someone who knows property law in this territory well enough to find a clause in a 20-year-old grant document. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride to Duran's Creek, which was saying something. The afternoon had gone gold and long, the light doing what it did at that hour in late summer, making everything look more significant than it probably was, stretching shadows out into something dramatic. Vivian sat with the documents in her lap and thought about Bowman's last observation. Constructed over time, it confirmed what she'd been thinking since her father's letter, since the pattern had first started to take shape in her mind. This was not opportunism. This was a plan. And plans of this kind had more moving parts than she'd identified yet. The coffee tin, she said, when they were halfway home. I know, Colton said. We'll go through it tonight. All of it. Every receipt. I know, Vivian. She looked at him. He was watching the road with the specific expression she'd come to associate with him working through a problem. Not anxious exactly, but focused inward, the way a person looks when they're running calculations they haven't shared yet. What are you not saying? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. There's a possibility the records won't be enough, he said. The first year I was buying materials, not cattle. If Greer's lawyer argues that infrastructure work doesn't constitute agricultural use under the grant language, we have a gap. How long a gap? 8-9 months. Is there anything else from that period? Any testimony that could establish you were operating toward agricultural use? Neighbors, suppliers, anyone who dealt with you during that first year? He thought about it. Alderman. I bought feed from him that first year, for the 2 horses I had at the time. Feed purchases for working animals could be argued as agricultural infrastructure. Bowman would have to make that argument. Bowman will make whatever argument the documents support, she said. That's what we need to give him. They got home after dark and found Holt and Ned had kept supper warm, and Clara had left a lamp burning in the kitchen, and the ordinary small acts of a household waiting for people to come back felt, in that moment, like more than they were. Vivian noticed it and didn't examine it too closely, the way you don't look directly at something that might disappear if you acknowledge it. They went through this coffee tin after supper, the 4 of them, Colton and Vivian at the kitchen table, Holt and Ned at the other end sorting piles as she directed. The contents of the tin were exactly as she'd anticipated, 7 years of receipts, payment records, notes in Colton's handwriting that were sometimes legible and sometimes not, cattle sale records that ranged from meticulous to nearly indecipherable depending on the season. She sorted them by year first, then by category within each year, then began building the chronology that Bowman needed. The first year was the problem, as Colton had predicted. Feed purchases, lumber, hardware, well repair supplies. No cattle records until month 14 when Colton had bought his first small herd from a rancher in the South County. There's a gap, she said at midnight when the chronology was spread across most of the table. I see it, Colton said. Alderman's feed records might fill part of it. Do you think he'd have records going back 7 years? Alderman keeps everything. His storage room is worse than this coffee tin. Then we go to Alderman first thing Monday. She looked at the spread of papers. There's also this. She picked up a handwritten note from the first-year pile. Barely a note. More a memo in Colton's own hand, dated 14 months before the first cattle purchase. It listed names, numbers, and what appeared to be a planned herd composition, breed types, age ranges, projected head count. This is a purchasing plan, she said, written a year before you bought the first animal. Holt leaned over to look at it. He had that on the wall in the barn that first winter, he said. I saw it when we came on. Vivian looked at Colton. Planning for agricultural use is not the same as executing it, but it establishes intent from the first year. Combined with the feed purchases for working animals, it builds a case that the land was being prepared for cattle operation from the beginning of your ownership. Colton looked at the memo. He'd clearly forgotten it existed. Bowman can use that? I think so. I'm not a lawyer, but it closes part of the gap. He looked at the papers, then at her, and his expression had the quality it got when something was costing him effort he hadn't budgeted for. I don't know what I'd do with all of this without you, he said. It was a plain, unguarded thing to say, and he said it plainly, without calculation. Vivian felt it land somewhere in the careful filing system she kept, but she didn't let herself respond to it directly. You'd figure it out, she said. It would take longer. Considerably longer. She started putting the sorted papers into the labeled folders she'd prepared. Go to sleep, she said. Holt, Ned, thank you. Colton, we leave for Alderman's at first light. Holt and Ned went. Colton stayed at the table a moment longer, looking at the organized folders. Then he said, Vivian. She looked up. I want to say something. All right. Not about the documents. He paused, and the pause had the quality she recognized now, the navigation without a map. I want to say that I know this isn't what you would have chosen, the way you came here, the situation. None of it. No, she agreed. It wasn't. And I know that tearing up the contracts in town today doesn't undo any of it, doesn't change what happened on that platform or what you've had to deal with since. No, it doesn't. He looked at his hands on the table. I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know that I'm aware of what it cost you, all of it, and I don't take it lightly. She looked at him for a long moment. He meant it. She was certain of that now, after 3 months of careful observation. He meant every word of it, without agenda, without expectation attached. I know, she said. Good night, Colton. He stood up. Good night. After he left, she sat alone at the kitchen table for a while with the sorted folders in front of her and the lamp burning low, and she sat with the things she'd been not examining since the road to Duran's Creek. It was clearer now than it had been then, and she was tired enough that she didn't have the energy to file it away again. She was not grateful to him. Gratitude was a simpler thing. She knew what gratitude felt like, and this was not it. What she felt was more complicated and more specific. It was the feeling of recognizing someone, of having watched a person carefully for 3 months and found, at the end of that watching, that the person was genuinely what they appeared to be, without gap between the surface and what was underneath. That was rare. She'd known it was rare for a long time. She hadn't expected to find it here, in these circumstances, which were nobody's idea of the right circumstances. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time since she'd come to the ranch, she slept without waking at 4. The visit to Alderman's feed store on Monday produced exactly what she'd hoped. 7 years of purchase records in a ledger system that was, as Colton had said, comprehensive. The first year showed feed purchases for 2 horses and various materials Alderman had supplied for the repair work. Alderman himself, a large man with a long memory and no particular interest in being anything other than straightforward, confirmed that he'd dealt with Colton from the first month of the Mercer operation. He was always buying toward cattle, Alderman said when Vivian asked him to characterize the early purchases. The infrastructure materials, the fencing materials, that's not what you buy if you're planning to run a homestead or farm grains. That's what you buy if you're planning a cattle operation. Anyone who knows ranching would read those purchases that way. Would you be willing to say that to a lawyer? Vivian asked. Alderman looked at her, looked at Colton. Is this about the Greer business? It is, Colton said. Then yes. Alderman said, without hesitation, and the flatness in his voice communicated that he had opinions about Greer's operations that were not favorable. I'll say whatever needs saying. Bowman incorporated the alderman records and the early purchase plan into the response filing with 2 days to spare, and the county clerk received it before the Greer challenge had been formally docketed, which Bowman said was the best possible outcome. The challenge would still require a formal response, but the substantive legal ground had shifted decisively, and he expected the matter would be resolved without a courthouse hearing. Vivian received this information on a Tuesday morning and felt the particular exhaustion of sustained effort reaching a temporary conclusion. Not relief exactly. There were still too many moving parts for relief, but the sense of a knot being worked loose from one end even while the other end was still tight. The other end was Blackstone Crossing and what was happening there, which had been shifting in small but accumulating ways since the Saturday of the torn contracts. Mrs. Hennessy had apparently been busy. Vivian learned this through a letter that arrived midweek, not from Mrs. Hennessy herself, but from the wife of the man who ran the small newspaper in Blackstone Crossing, a woman named Priscilla Foote, who wrote with the careful energy of someone who has decided to take a position and is choosing her words accordingly. She wrote that there was increasing sentiment in the town that the Hartwell situation had been handled dishonorably from the beginning, not by Colton Mercer, whose actions on the Saturday market day had been noted and discussed at length, but by the mechanism that had produced the auction in the first place. She wrote that questions were being asked about Prescott and Fitch and the unnamed creditor. She wrote that her husband was considering a piece for the newspaper. She also wrote more quietly in the last paragraph, Miss Hartwell, several women of this community would like to apologize to you and your sister for their silence on the day of the auction. We knew it was wrong and said nothing, and that is something we will have to live with. I hope you know that the opinion of this community is not fixed in the shape it held on that day. Vivian read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the letter down and went out to the east yard, where Clara was in the garden, with her hands in the soil, doing what she did every morning, checking, adjusting, maintaining the careful work of things that grew. Something good? Clara asked, without looking up. She'd developed an ability to read Vivian's footsteps by now. Something unexpected, Vivian said. She sat on the fence rail and looked at the garden. The tomatoes were done for the season now, the plants pulled, but Clara had put in fall greens along the south row, and they were coming in with the stubborn determination of things planted late, but planted well. People in town are reconsidering. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the greens. Does that change anything? Practically? Not much, not yet. She thought about it. But it matters. I told you it would matter eventually. You told me it matters to the ones who don't want to believe it, Clara said. Not the ones who do. Yes. Clara pulled a small weed from between 2 plants with the decisive gesture of someone who does not negotiate with weeds. I don't need them to reconsider, she said. I need the ranch to work and the garden to produce, and Ned to stop hovering near the fence line every morning pretending he's checking something. She paused. In that order. Vivian laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes up without preparation, which meant her chest had more room in it than it had a few months ago. Ned is not subtle. No, Clara agreed, but she was looking at the fall greens and there was something in her face that was not entirely the neutrality she usually wore on the subject of Ned. Something younger, less resolved. Vivian let it alone. Clara would find her own way to whatever was or wasn't happening there. She'd always been capable of finding her own way when people gave her room to do it. The letter from Edmund Hartwell that came the same week was the longest he'd sent. He'd heard about the Blackstone Crossing market day from someone at the Dunmore Ranch, the details somewhat garbled in the retelling, as second-hand accounts always were, but the essential shape intact. He wrote about it with the careful delicacy of a man who knows he's addressing something that involves his own failures and is trying not to make it about himself. He was proud of her, he wrote. He was proud of both of them. He was aware that saying so was insufficient, and that being proud of your children for surviving a situation you put them in was not the same as being a good father, and he was trying to sit with that distinction without excusing himself from it. He wrote, I've been thinking about the choice Colton Mercer made on that platform in Blackstone Crossing, and then the choice he made in the market on Saturday. I don't know him, and I'm aware I'm not in a position to evaluate character in the way I once thought I was. But what I hear is a man who does what he says. That's rarer than people think. Vivian wrote back that same evening. It was the longest letter she'd sent him too. She wrote about the ranch and the drought and Greer and the legal situation. She wrote about Clara's garden. She wrote, briefly, about the torn contracts and what it had meant in practical terms. The shift in her legal position, the shift in what she chose to do with it. She did not write about what she was feeling because she wasn't ready to put that in a letter to her father, and also because she was still sorting it out herself. But she wrote, at the end, "I think you might like him. I think most people who pay attention eventually do." She sealed the letter and set it on the table for the morning post and went to bed, and lay awake for a while thinking about what she'd written and deciding she didn't want to unsay it. The fire happened on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the market day in Blackstone Crossing. It started in the south end of the barn, in the storage area where hay was kept. The most dangerous place a fire could start, which was also the most common. Vivian smelled it before she heard anything, woke at 2 in the morning with the particular quality of smoke that means something serious, and was out of bed and down the hall before she'd fully processed being awake. She could see the glow through the kitchen window, not the barn itself yet, but the light that precedes structure fire in the dark, the wrong color, and the wrong direction. She hit the porch at a run and shouted once loud toward the bunkhouse. Then she ran for the barn. Colton was already there. He'd come from some other direction, from the north side of the house, she thought, which meant he'd been awake or nearly so. Holt and Ned came out of the bunkhouse at a run, and for the next 2 hours there was nothing except the work. The horses came out first. That was the first thing, always, and they did it without discussion, Colton and Ned going in for the animals while Holt and Vivian worked the water line from the well. The horses were frightened and difficult, and one of them, a gray gelding named Brackett, that had opinions in the best of circumstances, did what frightened horses do when they don't want to go where they're being taken. And Colton dealt with it with a focused physical patience that Vivian noted peripherally and filed away without slowing down. The hay storage was a loss. The south end of the barn, significant structural damage. The north end and the loft, saved, barely, by 2 hours of sustained effort and luck in the form of the light wind being from the south and not pushing the fire toward the main structure. When it was over, they stood in the pre-dawn dark looking at what was left. The smell of wet ash was thick and specific, the kind that gets into your clothes and your hair and stays there. Holt had a burn on his forearm that Vivian wrapped with the cloth and salve she'd brought from the house. Ned was uninjured but looked the way people look after sustained physical effort in conditions that could have gone worse. Wrung out, functional, not entirely present. Clara had come out at some point during the 2 hours and had been hauling water buckets with the focus and steadiness of someone who understood that this was not the moment for anything except the task in front of her. Colton stood looking at the damaged south end. His face in the early light was dirty and exhausted and working through something. Vivian came to stand beside him. "The hay reserves," she said. "Gone. Aldermen will have stock. The prices will be bad this late in the season." "I know. How much reserve do we have?" He looked at her. "Enough. It'll be tight for a few weeks, but manageable." "The structural repairs, do you have lumber?" "Not enough for this. I'll need to order." He paused. "It sets us back." "It sets back the timeline," she said. "Not the operation. Those are different." He looked at the barn for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know that." She could see that he did know it, that he was telling himself the same thing she was telling him, that the rational assessment was accessible to him even now. But there was something in his face that had nothing to do with the rational assessment, something personal about standing in front of a structure you'd spent years building and seeing a significant portion of it destroyed in 2 hours. "Colton," she said. He looked at her. "It's still standing," she said. "Most of it." He looked back at the barn. Then he exhaled, once, the long exhale of someone letting something go. "Most of it," he agreed. They cleaned up as much as they could before the sun was fully up. And then Holt made coffee, and they sat on the porch in the early morning, all 5 of them, the first time they'd all sat down together outside the kitchen table, and drank it and didn't say much. The smell of smoke was on everything. The gray gelding could be heard in the paddock where they'd moved the horses, moving restlessly, not yet settled from the night. Ned said, "I think I know how it started." Everyone looked at him. "The lantern in the south storage. I left it hanging rather than setting it down when I put up the evening feed." He said it flat, without evasion. I'm usually careful. Last night I wasn't. The porch was quiet. Colton looked at him for a moment. You're sure? I'm sure. Another silence. Holt looked at his coffee. Clara looked at Ned. Vivian looked at Colton. He said, All right. He drank his coffee. It's done. We'll deal with what's in front of us. Ned looked at him with an expression that contained more than Ned usually let show. You're not. I cost you. I know what it cost, Colton said. And I know you know. That's enough. He looked at his coffee cup. You've been working this ranch for 5 years. People make mistakes at the end of a long day. It's done. He said it without sentimentality and without anger, and that was what made it settle. Not a performance of forgiveness, just a man deciding what mattered and what the response to it would be and sticking to that decision. Vivian drank her coffee and watched the morning come in over the ridge and thought about all the things she'd been filing away since the day she arrived here. The ledger she kept in her head had gotten very long. At some point, a ledger stops being a record and starts being a verdict. Clara was the one who said it, which was typical. Clara had always been the one in their family who said the true things simply, without the careful architecture Vivian built around everything. You're going to tell him, Clara said. They were in the kitchen after the others had dispersed to their various tasks, washing up from the morning, and Clara said it the way she said most things, as a fact that she'd already established and was now reporting. Vivian looked at her. Tell who what? Clara gave her the look she reserved for statements that didn't warrant a response. I don't know what you're implying, Vivian said. Yes, you do. Clara, Vivian, she dried her hands. You've been watching him for 3 months the way you watch the ledger, adding things up. You finished adding a while ago and you're just double-checking at this point. She looked at her sister directly. You're going to tell him. Vivian looked at the window. The ranch yard was visible from here, and Colton was crossing it toward the damaged barn with a measuring tape and a notebook, which was his version of dealing with a problem. Assess it, quantify it, start the repair. It's not that simple, she said. I know it's not simple. You're the one who makes simple things complicated. That's not fair. It's accurate, Clara said, which is different. She folded the dishcloth. He tore up the contracts in front of the whole town. He drove to Duran's Creek with you 6 different times. He sat across a kitchen table from you at midnight for 2 weeks going through a coffee tin. Vivian. She said it with the patience of someone who has been watching something obvious develop at geological speed. He's not going to say it first. He's too careful. He'll wait until he's certain, and the way he figures out certainty is by watching you, which means you're both just watching each other. Vivian looked at her sister. Clara was 17 and had been through the same months she'd been through, the same platform and the same wagon and the same strange new life built from nothing at the edge of someone else's property. And she was standing in the kitchen with a dishcloth in her hand, being, as she often was, the most practical person in the room. I'll think about it, Vivian said. You've been thinking about it, Clara said. Think out loud, to him. She went back out to the garden, and Vivian stood at the window and watched Colton measure the damaged section of barn with a notebook in his hand, writing things down, already figuring out how to fix what had broken. She thought about the ledger. All those months of entries, the careful running total. At some point, the numbers don't need more checking. At some point, you just have to decide what you're going to do with what you've counted. She set down her dishcloth. She went outside. The morning was cool, the fire smell still on everything, the ranch going about its ordinary work in the way it always did. Imperfectly, necessarily, without any guarantee of what came next. She crossed the yard toward the barn, toward the man standing in front of the damaged section with a measuring tape and a notebook, who had not looked up yet but would in a moment, who had the kind of face that she'd been reading for 3 months and had finally, completely learned to read accurately. She was not ready. That was fine. Readiness was something people waited for when they were afraid, and she had decided, somewhere in the last few months of this unreasonable life, that she was done making decisions from fear. She was still walking when he looked up. He looked up when she was about 10 feet away, and his expression did the thing it did sometimes, that brief, unguarded moment before the careful steadiness came back, the moment where she could see exactly what he was thinking before he had a chance to arrange it into something more neutral. What she saw in that moment was not surprise. It was something closer to a man who has been waiting for something he wasn't sure was coming and has just seen it coming. She stopped in front of him. The measuring tape was still in his hand. The notebook had a column of numbers in it that she could see from where she stood. The careful arithmetic of damage and repair, the same impulse she had about everything, translated into his own language. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. Claire says I make simple things complicated." He looked at her. "She's not wrong." "I know." She took a breath. The fire smell was still on everything, on the boards of the damaged barn, on his coat, on the morning air. It was not a romantic setting, and she didn't need it to be. "I've been keeping track, since the beginning. Every honest thing you did, every time you said what you meant, every time you could have taken something you didn't. I kept a record of it." "I know," he said. "I watched you doing it." She stopped. "You knew?" "You watch everything. You always have." "I just waited." He set the measuring tape down on the fence post beside him. "I figured if I kept doing what I would have done anyway, eventually the record would say whatever it was going to say." She looked at him for a moment. "That's either very patient or very calculated." "Probably both," he said, without apology. She almost smiled. "The record," she said, "says that I trust you, completely, which is not something I expected to say to anyone for a very long time, and certainly not—" She gestured slightly at the damaged barn, the fire-smelling morning, the thoroughly unreasonable circumstances of everything. "Like this." He was quiet for a moment. The gray gelding was still moving in the paddock beyond the fence, hooves soft on the dirt. Somewhere on the south pasture, cattle moved in the ordinary way cattle move when they have no opinion about what is happening to the humans nearby. "Vivian," he said. It was the first time she'd heard him say her name without something else attached to it, without a question, without a practical reason. Just the name, by itself. "I know this isn't simple," she said. "I'm not asking for simple." "Good," he said, "because I've never had it, and I wouldn't know what to do with it." He picked up the notebook, closed it, set it on top of the measuring tape. "I've been in love with you since approximately the 3rd week," he said. "I didn't say anything because you were still deciding whether I was trustworthy, and pushing the question before you'd finished deciding seemed like exactly the kind of thing that would confirm I wasn't." She looked at him. He said it the same way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without performance, with the particular quality of a man who had decided to stop finding reasons to say things later. "The 3rd week?" she said. "The root cellar," he said. "You reorganized it in a way that made complete sense, and then you told Holt he'd manage without making him feel stupid about it. That was the 3rd week." She thought about the root cellar, the shelves, Holt's slightly stunned face. "That's a very specific thing to fall in love with someone over," she said. "I'm a specific person." She looked at him, at this man she had catalogued and measured and watched and argued with and ridden beside through drought and legal documents and fire and the accumulated ordinary difficulty of a working ranch. This person who was not simple and not perfect and was exactly, completely what he had appeared to be from the beginning, which turned out to be the rarest thing she'd ever encountered. "I love you too," she said. "That took longer. I needed more data." He laughed. It was not something she'd heard from him often. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that changes a face. "I know," he said. "I watched you collecting it." She took the 2 steps between them, and he met her in the middle, and it was not graceful. She was still wearing the clothes she'd fought a fire in, and the measuring tape fell off the fence post, and neither of them did anything about it. It was the kind of moment that is exactly what it is, without improvement. After a while, he said, against her hair, "Claire's watching from the garden." "I know," Vivian said. "Let her watch." The Greer matter resolved itself, in the end, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the particularly satisfying anticlimax of a legal challenge that runs out of ground to stand on. Bowman filed the complete response with the county seat within the deadline, and the challenge to the deed transfer was reviewed by the Territorial Land Authority and dismissed on the grounds that the documentation of continuous agricultural use was unambiguous, and the alleged defect in the transfer was not supported by the grant language when read in full context. Bowman wrote to Vivian directly with the news, which was, she noted, a sign that he'd formed his own opinion about who was driving the legal work on the Mercer Ranch. He added, in a postscript, that the Territorial Land Authority had opened a separate inquiry into the water fees Greer had collected without legal basis across multiple properties in the East County. Not just from Colton, but from 3 other landowners, including Margaret Dunmore. He expected the inquiry to be uncomfortable for Greer. It was. Vivian heard about it in stages over the following months, from Ned's supply run reports, from Mrs. Hennessy's letters, from Margaret Dunmore herself, who had become, in a way that neither of them had entirely planned, something like a correspondent. The water fee inquiry became a land fraud inquiry. The unnamed creditor behind Prescott and Fitch turned out to be a holding company with connections to a territorial legislator, which was the kind of information that once surfaced had consequences that moved faster than Vivian expected. Prescott and Fitch quietly left the county. The holding company dissolved. It was not justice, exactly. It was too messy and too slow and too incomplete to call it that cleanly. But it was something. The shape of it, the way it fell apart when people stopped being ignorant of their own documents, when people stopped being alone with their problems. That had something to do with what she and Colton had done, and with what Bowman had done, and with Alderman's records and Margaret Dunmore's refusal to sell, and Taft's Thursday ride to Duran's Creek. It was the accumulated result of many people deciding, one at a time, to know what they owned and stand on it. Edmund Hartwell came to the ranch in November, when the Dunmore contract ran its course and wasn't renewed. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in weather that couldn't decide between fall and winter, and he stood in the yard and looked at the ranch with the expression of a man seeing something for the first time that he'd been picturing in his head for months. Vivian met him at the gate. She'd thought about this meeting many times and had imagined various versions of it, some of them angry, some of them cold, some of them more forgiving than she'd felt capable of when she first arrived here. What actually happened was that she saw his face when he came through the gate, and the anger that had been the dominant note for so long shifted into something more accurate. He was her father. He had failed her badly, and he knew it, and was carrying it, and would probably carry it for the rest of his life. And she was not going to pretend none of it had happened, but she was also not going to make him stand in the yard indefinitely. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat so many nights with the ledger and the coffee tin and the organized folders, and he drank the coffee she put in front of him, and he looked around the kitchen with its reorganized shelves and the herbs Clara had dried hanging from the ceiling and the east window that let in the morning light. He looked at all of it with the particular attention of a man who is trying to understand the shape of a life he didn't build. "It's a good place," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Are you—" He stopped, tried again. "Are you all right? Actually?" She considered the question, which deserved a real answer. "Yes," she said. "Not the way I would have been all right if none of this had happened. Differently." He nodded slowly. He understood that, she thought. He understood the difference between the life that gets handed to you and the one you build from what's left after the first one falls apart. Colton came in from this afternoon work a half hour later, and she watched the 2 men in the room together, her father, and the man who had paid an enormous price on a platform in Blackstone Crossing for reasons that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with the memory of a sister in Oregon who'd had nobody step in. They were awkward with each other in the way of men who carry significant amounts of guilt between them and know it, but they were polite and honest, and by the time supper was on the table, something had settled between them that wasn't friendship, but was at least the beginning of understanding. Edmund stayed 3 days. On the last evening, he found Vivian alone in the kitchen doing the accounts and sat across from her and said, "I want to explain. Not to excuse it, just to explain." "I know you do," she said. "You don't have to." "I think I do." He looked at his hands. "I kept thinking there was going to be a way through it, that if I just held on a little longer, something would change. I've thought that way my whole life. Your mother used to say I was an optimist, and I thought that was a good thing." He paused. "I've been reconsidering." "Optimism isn't the problem," Vivian said. "Optimism without a plan is the problem." He looked at her. "You sound like your mother." "Do I?" "More every year." He said it with the complicated expression of someone remembering and grieving and being glad at the same time. She would have liked this place. She would have liked him. Vivian looked at the ledger in front of her. "I know," she said. He went back to the South County with a job offered by aldermen who needed someone reliable for the store accounts and who had apparently heard enough about Edmund Hartwell's bookkeeping background to think it was worth a chance. It was a modest thing, but it was solid, and Edmund took it with the seriousness of a man who has learned the difference between those two qualities. Vivian and Colton married in March, when the ground was still cold but the light had changed, that first shift in the quality of the afternoon that says winter is losing its argument. It was not a large affair because neither of them wanted a large affair. It was the ranch yard and the people who had earned the right to be there, Holt and Ned, Clara, Edmund, Margaret Dunmore, who drove out in her wagon with a jar of preserves and the expression of someone who had decided to witness something important, Alderman and his wife, Bowman, who came from Duran's Creek and was characteristically spare in his congratulations but present, which was the thing that mattered. Mrs. Hennessy came. She made the 15-mile trip on her own in a wagon she drove herself, and she brought a quilt she'd made over the winter, and when she pressed it into Vivian's hands, she said quietly, so no one else could hear, "I should have said something that day on the platform. I'm still sorry." Vivian took the quilt. "You said something after," she said. "That counted. It's not the same." "No?" Vivian agreed. "But it's what there was." It was that kind of day. Real, imperfect, full of the specific texture of people who had been through something together and were standing on the other side of it. The vows they said were plain and personal, and neither of them was entirely composed when they said them, which was fine. Composed was for people performing something. This was the real version. There were hard years after that because the frontier did not stop being hard once a person's personal circumstances improved. A winter that killed a third of the herd in the second year of their marriage. A dispute with a neighboring property over a fence line that required 2 trips to Bowman and 6 weeks of aggravation before it was settled. A summer so dry it made the drought of Vivian's first months at the ranch look moderate. The barn got repaired and then needed repair again. The accounts had good years and tight years, and the tight years required exactly the kind of clear-eyed planning that Vivian had always been good at, and Colton had learned to trust. And together they made it work in the particular way that things get made to work when 2 people are pulling in the same direction and honest with each other about the load. Clara stayed on at the ranch for 2 years, and in that time grew a kitchen garden that became genuinely legendary in that end of the county. Not because she was remarkable about it in any showy way, but because she was consistent and patient and paid attention to what the soil needed rather than what she wanted to grow. In the second year, Ned asked her a question that was not technically about gardening, and she answered it after thinking about it for 3 days. And what followed was its own separate story, set slightly to one side of Vivian's. They built a small house on the western edge of the Mercer property, close enough to be neighbors, far enough to be independent, which was exactly what Clara required. Edmund Hartwell never fully rebuilt the version of himself that had existed before the debts and the auction and the particular humiliation of a man who believed too long in something that wasn't there. But the man who emerged from the reconstruction was quieter, steadier, more honest about his own limits. He visited the ranch often, and in his later years was a presence that Vivian's children grew up with, a grandfather who told stories about the frontier with the specific authority of someone who had seen both its cruelty and its capacity for unexpected grace. There is something she understood in the years that followed that she had not understood on the platform in Blackstone Crossing, or on the wagon bench on the first ride out, or even in the long nights over the coffee tin sorting receipts by lamplight. She had thought, through all of those months, that she was surviving, building towards something safer, accumulating enough evidence to trust the ground she was standing on. What she understood later was that she had been doing something more than surviving from very early on. She had been choosing, one decision at a time, without always recognizing it as choice. Choosing to reorganize the root cellar, choosing to ask direct questions, choosing to read the deeds, choosing to walk across a fire-smelling yard toward a man with a measuring tape and a notebook. Survival is what you do when you have no options. What she had been doing, from the moment she sat up on the edge of the bed in the cedar-smelling room and looked at the hawk making its circle over the ridge, was living. The difference matters. She would say that to Clara's oldest daughter once, when the girl was 17 and the world had dealt her something unfair and she was trying to decide what to do with it. Surviving is getting through. Living is deciding, even when you don't have good options, that you're going to make something of what's in front of you. It doesn't have to be dramatic, It doesn't have to be a torn contract in the middle of a market crowd. Sometimes it's just reorganizing the shelves in a root cellar and telling a man he'll manage, and meaning it. The woman who had stood on the auction platform in Blackstone Crossing, frightened, humiliated, calculating her odds, keeping her face still because she would not give the crowd the satisfaction, that woman had not disappeared. She was still in Vivian Mercer completely, still the one who kept the ledger and asked the direct questions and read the documents that other people hadn't bothered to read. She had not been replaced by someone softer or more fortunate. She had simply found a place where those qualities were the right shape for the life around them, and that was its own kind of luck. And she knew it. On a November evening in the 5th year of their marriage, when the first snow of the season was coming down in the slow, indecisive way of early winter, Colton came in from the barn and found Vivian at the kitchen window watching it. The accounts were done for the week. The children were asleep. The house had the particular quiet of a place that has been worked in and lived in and is resting. He stood beside her and looked at the snow. After a while he said, "Are you all right?" She considered it the way she considered everything, thoroughly, without rushing to the comfortable answer. Then she said, "Yes, completely." He looked at her sideways. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She looked at the snow coming down on the fence lines and the barn and the east yard where Clara's original garden had long since been expanded and restructured into something serious and productive. "I was thinking about the first day, the platform. I think about it sometimes too," he said. "Do you?" "I think about what would have happened if I'd been 3 hours later getting to town, or if I'd decided it wasn't my problem." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about how close it was." "Everything is close," she said. "Everything always almost doesn't happen." He thought about that. "That's either comforting or terrifying." "Both," she said. "Usually both." Usually, the snow came down, indifferent and clean, covering the yard that had held fires and drought and the accumulated imperfect effort of years. Somewhere in the barn, the horses moved quietly. Somewhere in the small house to the west, Claire's family was doing whatever they were doing on a snowy evening, which was their own life now, their own complete and separate thing. Vivian put her hand in Colton's, which was something she still chose to do, every time knowing it was a choice and not a habit. He closed his fingers around hers, which was something he still did with attention, like a man who knows the value of a thing and does not intend to stop knowing it. The ranch sat on its 400 acres and held them all. Imperfect, real, built from damage and stubbornness and the accumulated weight of small, honest decisions made over time. Not a perfect life. Never that. But theirs, completely, and chosen every day. That is the only kind worth having.